Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Secret Life of the American Musical, How Broadway Shows Are Built, by Jack Viertel, narrated by David Pittu. Tuning Up, or How I Came to Write This Book. I've never been much of an international sightseer. I've never been eager to tramp around ancient ruins or bask in the architecture of the great cathedrals of Europe. I understand these activities have enormous spiritual and aesthetic value for a lot of people who are fascinated and moved, sometimes to tears, to be in the presence of the ancients. I'm married to a woman who is rarely so content as when she has the chance to wander the corridors of history, but it's never meant that much to me. When I find myself in one of these places, more often than not, I begin to think about Broadway musicals. I consider it a defect in my level of curiosity. It's shameful, really. Musicals have provided me with the kind of nourishment that crumbling walled cities have not. I've loved them since my parents and my grandmother Daisy took me to see Mary Martin as Peter Pan just before my 6th birthday. In fact, along with non-musical plays, they've been the source of most of my education and consumed an enormous amount of my thinking and my emotional development, which sometimes makes me feel foolish. But I have to thank one particular set of ruins for the fact that this book got written. I was clambering around the Greek island of Delos, Apollo's home, on a hot August afternoon when it occurred to me that I ought to teach musical theater to college students. Why Delos? Why teach? Why that moment? Whoever knows for sure why a thought pops into your head? I could claim that it was because Apollo was the god of music and poetry, and that got me thinking, but I doubt anything that erudite was lamping around my brain. I have a feeling that the ruined columns lying in piles all around me reminded me of the poster for the Nathan Lane production of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which probably caused me some internal embarrassment. While I was trying to turn from the mortifying to the high-minded, the idea of imparting knowledge to young people somehow slipped into my brain. The fact is, almost everything reminds me of the theater, and certainly ancient ruins do. There are fabulous semi-preserved amphitheaters all around Greece and Italy, and even ruins that never were performance spaces seem to me to be inherently dramatic. They make me think of declamatory speech and kissing in the shadows, murder in the dark, and coup d'etat. But also, to be honest, they call up Nathan Lane in a toga, and distant memories of Zero Mostel, Jack Gilford, David Burns, and John Carradine singing Everybody Ought to Have a Maid. That's always been a kind of heaven to me, and ruins are about the world of the gods. There was another connection as well, a family connection. Shakespeare wrote about Greeks and Romans, and what little I know about them I learned from Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and the others. My wife's uncle, Harry Levin, for many years head of the comparative literature department at Harvard, used to spend an entire semester picking apart only 4 of Shakespeare's plays, holding every line up to the light and questioning why it was written the way it was written, what led to it, and what it led to. He was like a Swiss watchmaker taking apart and reassembling a perfect timepiece. It was an intense funhouse ride for Shakespeare nuts, and it was glorious. But no one had ever done that for Gypsy or Guys and Dolls or The Book of Mormon. Why not? Because Broadway musicals can't compare to Shakespeare? Says who? If Shakespeare is England's national theater, aren't Broadway musicals ours? Footnote. I acknowledge poetic realism and the greatness of O'Neill, Wilder, Williams, Miller, Albee, Tony Kushner, and August Wilson, of course. That's our other national theater. End of footnote. Being a man of limited imagination but a certain dull cunning, I soon thought of stealing Uncle Harry's concept lock, stock, and barrel. The only thing that would be different was the repertoire. And why should I be the one to teach it? My reasoning was simple and, I hope, not overly self-inflated. I'd been working as a dramaturgically inclined Broadway producer for 2 decades, developing new works and reviving old ones, and I'd been the artistic director of the Encore series of concert musicals at New York City Center since 2000. I didn't and don't claim to have any God-given wisdom about musicals, but I'd been in the trenches for a long time and worked on dozens. I structured the course quickly in my head while pretending to admire all that was left of Apollo's hometown. Was the lyric of My Hometown from What Makes Sammy Run coursing through my brain at the time? Quite possibly. It was Harry Levin's course, but the texts would be Gypsy, Guys and Dolls, My Fair Lady, and South Pacific. 3 two-hour sessions for each show. The students would have to read them aloud to understand them. Why those 4 shows? A showbiz drama, a classic New York comedy, an intellectual romance, and a wartime epic, and each of them close to perfect. Why not? New York University's Tisch School was happy to hear of my interest and assigned me a slot. The course was clean and simple, and it just kind of worked. We closely examined the 4 classic musicals, page by page, trying to piece out why every line of dialogue was there, what every lyric accomplished, and how music supported whatever the fundamental idea of the show was. The course assumed that every great musical has a single idea, a single stake, and that much of the writer's job is to discover what it is, and then cut away the thicket of things that don't belong, so that the idea can be explored and celebrated in a way that audiences take home with them. The course asked the question, how do all the diverse tools of the trade, music, rhyme, comedy, character, dance, drama, storytelling, even scenery and costumes, lights and orchestrations, get pointed in the same direction toward the same goal? In a sense, it was an architecture class, exploring how a structure is designed and built that is strong enough to support a single vision and fulfill or confound an audience's expectations, as required in the circumstance. The course proved popular, and it wasn't long before I added a second one, which examined what Broadway folks call a song plot. Not to be confused with the plot of the show, a song plot is like a graph on which the songs in a musical story can be laid out. It's a surprisingly consistent diagram: an opening number, an I want song for the main character or characters, a conditional love song, If I Loved You, not I Love You, a production number, and so forth, right through the finale. The not-so-secret agenda of these courses was to point out that this kind of craftsmanship, gradually abandoned beginning in the late 1970s, has led to a much more chaotic life for the Broadway musical. It may be incredibly hip to leave basic storytelling techniques behind and light out for the territory, as Huck Finn did on his raft, with neither a map nor a rule book. But an awful lot of shows get hopelessly lost that way and disappear into the woods, never to be heard from again. And most of the works that have experienced real lasting success in the years since the golden age of Broadway are, when the surface is scratched, deeply traditional and craftsmanlike. I'm talking about Sweeney Todd, The Producers, Hairspray, Wicked, and the Book of Mormon, which, contemporary though it may be, is really just an orthodox mashup of The King and I, Guys and Dolls, and The Music Man with a 21st century voice and subject. The students wanted to talk about those shows as much as the classics. This was their Broadway, and so Mormon was added to the syllabus. We examined I Want songs from Wicked and how a deadly serious 6-character musical like Next to Normal copes with the need for some noisy comic relief. Everything was fair game. I'm grateful for the opportunity to teach at Tisch and to interact with a student body that is as curious, energized, and passionate as any group of young people I've ever encountered. It's great fun for me, and for a few years I assumed that was that. But after a while, I started to get invited to give talks outside the classroom, and that's when people started asking me when I was going to write a book about all of this. In some ways, looking at Broadway shows mapped out in the way I had mapped them seemed like a secret language that was fun to let other people in on. Frankly, I had my doubts about this book proposition because the classes were really for young would-be professionals, not just musical theater fans. But the outside talks were for fans, and they seemed to be the ones urging me on. Part of the process, then, has been to take what began as an academic course and broaden it into a wider realm, the story of how musicals got made in their heyday, the much vaunted but never quite defined golden age, and how they get made today. Some of the songs and shows are ancient history to my students, and perhaps to the younger generation of listeners as well, but I don't apologize for that. Ancient history can have its inspiring effects, as I learned by accident on Delos. On the other hand, recent history can be educational in a different way, especially if you've been a part of it. When the producer Margot Lyon asked me to take a look at the John Waters movie Hairspray, for instance, I told her I thought it was a perfectly silly idea for a musical. It felt almost like a home movie. But Lyon saw in it the bones of a classic musical theater story waiting to be exposed, and she was completely correct. The show succeeds with general audiences while the original film remains only a cult classic, because the show has real architecture in addition to a real subject. It opens the door and lets everyone out of the closet. But it would never have worked without the first-rate craftsmanship of storytelling that took 5 writers and a world-class director to achieve. I was the dramaturg, a German word that, in this case, translates as nudge. One of the most heated arguments I lost, thank God, was with Hairspray's director Jack O'Brien about the penultimate moment in the show. The scene is set in the local eventorium, where the entire company is gathered for the Miss Teenage Hairspray contest of some year in the early 60s. Only 2 people are missing: the heroine, Tracy Turnblad, and her mother, the ample American, Edna, played in drag by gravel-voiced Harvey Fierstein in a fat suit. But there is a surprise coming. On stage is a gigantic can of hairspray, and someone is hiding in it. Who? It had to be Tracy, I argued. She's the heroine of the piece. She's engineered the entire event so that it will work out to a happy ending. She's the one who is going to arrive to save the day. She has to be in the can so she can arrive in the most spectacular way. Nonsense, said O'Brien. Edna is in the can. Why? I asked petulantly. It makes no sense. Because, he said, when the audience sees Harvey Fierstein explode out of that can in a huge red dress, they're all going to come from sheer joy, and they won't care about anything else. He was right, of course. Show business and dramaturgy, the happiest war ever waged. I still maintain that the end of Hairspray makes very little logical sense, and I'm still right. But what does it get me? Musical theater is that exact thing, the intersection of craftsmanship and the irrationally thrilling. When you know who the characters are and what they want, when you root hard for them all night, when you've been properly cared for and fussed over by artists who know how, you are set up to have the greatest creators reach right past your intellectual faculties at the last minute and press down on that joy buzzer that lurks in the back part of your brain. When they do, your spirit levitates, just like Peter Pan heading out the window to Neverland. I've seen it happen, and that's why I wrote this book. A note about the shows discussed, and a few other matters. The title of this book was originally The Secret Life of the Broadway Musical, but I changed it when I realized I was going to write only about American shows. During various periods of Broadway's history, the street has been dominated by musicals from England, but I've chosen not to deal with any of them. This may reflect a personal prejudice, but I hope it has more to do with the British musical itself, which, when not imitating the American musical, has always been created around one of its own set of traditions and a history of entertainment. Gilbert and Sullivan, the music hall, the Christmas pantomime, the Dickensian yarn, that are distant cousins of our own. British musicals, though they've sometimes been the economic engine of Broadway, don't actually help tell the story I wanted to tell, so I've left them out. No disrespect intended. I've not spent a lot of time in these pages talking about dance in any formal way. I don't feel qualified to do so. Dance has been an integral part of Broadway musicals since the beginning. The Black Crook, arguably the very first musical, allegedly came into being in 1866 because a Parisian dance troupe was stranded when the New York theater it was supposed to appear in burned down, and the company was rescued by being shoehorned into a musical melodrama. But even so, I don't have a great deal to say on the subject of how dance has evolved in the modern musical. Dream ballets existed from the 1930s on, became standard fare in the 40s with Agnes de Mille and Jerome Robbins doing most of the innovating, and then lived on to be ridiculed by some of today's musicals. Big production numbers have usually featured dance breaks, and dance has always been a useful, sometimes blissful tool for romantic expression. As the director-choreographer Warren Carlyle said about musicals, when you can no longer speak, you sing. When you can no longer sing, you dance. I don't think I have anything further to add. I've also returned often in these pages to a handful of mostly classic shows, at the expense of discussing many others. Gypsy, My Fair Lady, Fiddler on the Roof, Guys and Dolls, Little Shop of Horrors, Hairspray, The Book of Mormon, and a few others predominate, and in some cases their entire plots seem to emerge. The reasons for this are numerous, but the best one is simply that these are the shows that taught me the most, that I spend the most time teaching. Perhaps they're not perfect, and none of them is my absolute favorite. That would be Follies. But for the purposes of this book, they were the most useful to me, and that seemed reason enough. As a consequence, a number of successful and well-constructed shows, Kiss Me Kate and La Cage aux Folles come to mind, are only occasionally mentioned. Rodgers and Hammerstein get a lot of space, but not one show in particular. There's a lot about Stephen Sondheim, and not enough, perhaps, about his wonderful contemporaries Jerry Bach and Sheldon Harnick, John Kander and Fred Ebb, Charles Strauss and Lee Adams, Jerry Herman, Bob Merrill, and the like. And there are other important musicals, Funny Girl, Brigadoon, and Annie Get Your Gun, to name just three, that have escaped notice altogether. A number of important creators whose work I admire, William Finn comes immediately to mind, are similarly not to be found. This book isn't intended to be a survey or a complete history of Broadway musicals, and it is not even slightly democratic. It has no intention of paying tribute to all worthy competitors, nor is it any kind of instruction manual. It's a personal way of talking about the art and craft of making musicals, very much from one man's point of view. I've tried to use what has seemed most telling to me, and I've tended to wander off in all directions from time to time, just as I'm making the case that a well-structured musical should never do so. There are stories that I felt were worth telling, bits and pieces of trivia that I've accumulated, and somewhat off-topic observations that seemed worth a paragraph here and there. I considered cutting each one, but most have remained, for better or worse. The book is, in some senses, a ramble. One other point is worth making. Nothing in these pages is meant to imply that the artists creating musicals knowingly follow a well-worn formula. Quite the opposite is true. While musicals tend to follow patterns, the writers and directors who create them are generally rediscovering how to make each show completely fresh and original every time out. It's only in hindsight that the patterns emerge. Not only that, there are big hit shows in which few of the patterns I describe actually appear. Take a look at Chicago or 1776, if you doubt it. Not every show has an I Want song, or a conditional love song, or a main event, or even an 11 o'clock number. But most do, or a reasonable facsimile thereof, and that's what makes writing about them fun. Still, any listener of this book who wants to point triumphantly to some show that doesn't seem to be built on the classic chassis I'm writing about will get no argument from me, just a tip of the hat. If I still wore a hat. Chapter 1. Overture. Is the American musical an animal or a machine? That's a peculiar question, but think about it for a moment. A machine is made from standardized, manufactured parts, assembled according to a particular logic. When switched on, it does a task, or perhaps a series of them. An animal is, in some ways, not so very different. We human animals are also standardized to a great extent. 2 eyes, 2 lips, a nose, as Betty Comden and Adolph Green wrote, and we perform a certain set of actions, some of them repetitively. These include the mundane, brushing our teeth, and the profound, falling in love. We're like machines, but we're not machines. We're individuals with our own hearts, our own brains, our own ways of looking at the world informed by experience, temperament, taste, and desire. We're better than machines. A lot of Broadway musicals are well-made machines, but the best ones rise above. They stand up and dance on their own, with their own unique beating hearts. This book is mostly about those very best ones, and about deconstructing the machined parts that allowed them to work. Why? Because that other element, the lightning bolt that gives life, can be described but never entirely understood. That intangible thing that separates the special Broadway shows from the routinely competent ones. My Fair Lady from Camelot, or Hairspray from Legally Blonde, is partly a matter of craft, but who really knows what makes that final difference happen? Every now and then the divine spirit comes down for a visit, that's all. The idea behind this book, though, is that such blessed events don't have much of a chance of happening unless the machine is up and running. Without the lungs and liver, there's no way for the heart to soar, or the brain to make lightning and thunder. So this book is an attempt to describe the mechanics of the great musicals, how they were planned and built, and why so often they get under our skin and remain a part of us for a lifetime. The architecture of musicals dates back to Broadway's golden age, the dates of which can be agreed upon by no one. My opinion is that it begins on the opening night of Oklahoma, March 31st, 1943, and ends on the opening night of A Chorus Line, July 25th, 1975. During those decades, musicals found a form that was so rock-solid and so satisfying to audiences that the components of the form served as the roadmap for creators who revised and refined but never abandoned it. There were great musicals produced before and after, of course, and I do have some things to say about shows in the 20s and 30s, and about shows that Stephen Sondheim and his collaborators wrote in the post-Chorus Line era. And there's a lot to be written about shows like Wicked, The Producers, The Book of Mormon, and, of course, those produced by the Disney Empire. But my golden age ends where it ends. By the mid-70s, the world had changed both on and off stage in a way that caused a flurry of experimentation, some notable disasters, and a period of wandering in the desert. The 70s and 80s saw a scattering of attempts to exploit the fashionable on Broadway, hence musicals like Got to Go Disco, a curiosity that tried to cash in on the disco craze without a discernible plot or characters, and Rockabye Hamlet, a rock version of Shakespeare's classic that proved something really was rotten in the state of Denmark. There was a lot of confusion about appropriate subject matter, too. Was it really a strong idea to write a musical about the Shroud of Turin? Into the Light gave it a try, leading to one of the more memorable lead sentences ever published in a Variety review. Those who never miss a musical about the Shroud of Turin will rush to Into the Light. There seemed to be a lot of amateurism around, and to some extent that's still the case today. As the ideas for new musicals and the justifications for producing them got thinner and more erratic, the craftsmanship often evaporated altogether. Part of the reason for this, to be fair, was that there were suddenly some extremely compelling shows rooted in the most unlikely source material, seemingly semi-improvised. Hair may have started the trend, which has continued and encouraged both inspired outsiders and rank incompetents alike. Opinions may differ on shows like Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson and Passing Strange, but their failure to find large, appreciative audiences has a lot to do with their formlessness. Audiences really do like to be told a definite story in a compelling way. It has to have captivating characters, an exciting challenge for them to solve, and a solution that's worthy of the time we've taken to watch it. Nowhere was this clearer to me than in the long journey taken by August Wilson's play The Piano Lesson, which is, admittedly, not a musical, though it has a couple of amazingly powerful musical sequences in it. Set in Pittsburgh, the play revolves around an almost 3-hour argument between a brother and a sister over who gets to control the piano in the parlor, a mystical heirloom onto which the family's history was carved by an ancestor who was a slave. The sister wants to save it as a testament to the family's suffering. The brother wants to sell it to a collector and buy a piece of land in Mississippi so he can start a farm and begin to help the current generation prosper. What does one do with one's legacy? The play is also a ghost story. The spirit of the white man, whose family once owned both the piano and the land in question, has arrived from Mississippi and is terrifying the residents of the house, though what exactly he wants isn't stated. It is a wildly entertaining, imaginative evening. In the original script, the ghost was exorcised in the end, but the question of who winds up with the piano was left unresolved. At its world premiere at the Yale Repertory Theater, audiences appreciated the play, but they left the theater a little baffled. Through 3 or 4 out-of-town productions, I kept gently asking the playwright a simple question. After 3 hours of argument, who gets the piano? He purported not to be interested in the question. I actually think he just didn't know the answer. He'd given strong arguments to both combatants. With a Broadway opening staring him in the face, he finally went into retreat and came back with 2 new scenes, one in the middle of the second act in which the sister explains why, although she won't let go of the piano, she'll never play it again, and one at the end where, to exorcise the ghost, she changes her mind and plays it, driving away the spirits of the past. She earns the piano, and her brother gives in. The first night the play was performed with those 2 new scenes, the audience whooped and cheered at the end and stood up and whistled. They had their answer. Thematically, August Wilson may have been right that it didn't matter who got the piano. The argument was more important to him than the outcome. He could have found a justification for the brother winning, and the audience would probably have been just as happy. But in a show about who will end up with a piano, the spectators want to know and won't be satisfied until they do. That's what makes a story, as anyone who has ever told a bedtime story to a child or watched a baseball game will immediately understand. Something is at stake. Someone wins the stake and someone else loses. There are mechanical niceties, and they have to be observed, the lady or the tiger notwithstanding. But the niceties are different for musicals than for straight plays. Unlike in any other kind of story, the characters in musicals keep interrupting themselves to burst into song. They dance, they leap, they speak one line and sing the next. They convey what's in their brains in dialogue, then turn what's in their hearts into melody and movement. And when the men and women who are creating this odd hybrid form of storytelling do it brilliantly, audiences respond in a way that is as unique as the form itself, because the storytellers are operating on different parts of the human brain simultaneously. In that sense, musicals have more latitude than plays. Audiences understand the story, the characters, and what's at risk for them as they try to achieve their dreams. But sitting there in the dark, they also experience a certain kind of visceral charge that goes well beyond the logic of storytelling. Musicals tap into an emotion center that creates profound feelings of ecstasy, sadness, heroism, nobility, or simple giddiness. That's why the hair stands up on the back of your neck. That most illogical but universally recognizable sensation. It happens right after Harold Hill says, "You'll feel something akin to the electric thrill I once enjoyed when Gilmore, Liberati, Pat Conway, the great Creatore, W.C. Handy, and John Philip Sousa all came to town on the very same historic day." And then sings the line, "76 trombones led the big parade." The audience falls apart right then. You can argue that familiarity is the cause and that we're all waiting for him to sing it, and you can certainly point out that we're being manipulated.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?